Buy-to-let landlords, listen to this. If you thought the Conservatives' Renters Reform Bill was bad enough, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because that bill didn't go through, right? Many of you think, oh, it's going to be kicked into the long grass. No, Labour government are bringing in their own bill. They're scrapping the other one. They're tearing it up for some reason. And they're going for a new bill called the Renters' Rights Bill. Not Renters Reform, Renters' Rights Bill. You see the subtle difference there. And I want to go through now how it is likely to affect buy-to-let landlords. So let's go through some of the key changes of this bill, which hasn't come into power yet. It's not on the statute books yet, but it's going through Parliament. They've got a massive majority Labour, so they will definitely be able to railroad this through. Okay, the first thing is they call it enhanced security for tenants, not landlords, enhanced security for tenants. And what this aims to provide is to give greater security by abolishing, you know what's coming next, Section 21 no-fault evictions. Okay, now obviously this might have come under the last bill, but the government, the reason it took so long to go through and then that not going through is a lot of people in the Conservative Party are probably landlords themselves, or they just see a reasonable case for when you're running a business. It's got to be fair on both sides, and not being able to sort of say to a tenant, well, look, your tenant's ended, would you go please, or I want this property back, you've been there 5 years, here's notice. You know, that's very worrying for landlords who are renting out their property, that the tenant may be able to say, you know, no, I'm not going. And the other thing they were trying to do is put the courts in a position where they could handle these cases, because if you haven't got a Section 21, you're on a Section 8, which often ends up in court. And if the courts can't handle this, it could take 6 months or a year to evict a tenant, which would normally only take 2 months. Of course, the government are blaming landlords for homelessness. They said, oh, most homeless people are evicted by a private landlord. Well, of course, if someone's coming to the end of a tenancy, of course, they should just leave in that house or that property. They should just leave it, but they don't. They say, no, serve me a Section 21 notice, then I'm not going to leave. The council say, don't leave. If you leave, we're not going to help you get rehoused. So they stick there until the landlord has physically evicted them through the courts, which might take 6 months to a year. And then they get housed by the council in some way. Now, not everyone's like that. Most people are reasonable. Most tenants are reasonable. They come to the end of a tenancy and they move on. And that's the normal way to do it. But Labour they've definitely said this. They're going to abolish Section 21 as soon as this bill comes on the statute books. Now, they've introduced about 30 different bills in the King's speech the other day. So it's not likely to happen fast, but I think within the next year this could be on the books or sooner even. And I don't know why they've torn up the Renters Reform Bill and start again. It seems like a waste of money, a waste of time, particularly when they've got 30 bills to get through. It's not going to happen. But all new governments do this. They want to bring in new laws. You know, I mean, you could just change existing laws. No, they want to bring in new laws. Okay. Second thing is rent controls. This is one of the most contentious issues, and it's been tried in Scotland and Wales and it doesn't work. This means the government plans to cap rent increases. What will that mean? Landlords will just put up the rent before the cap comes in. And the change is to prevent excessive rent hikes, they call it, but may limit the profitability for landlords. Now, I know landlords have never put up their rent for years. In fact, I often don't, because you come to the end of a tenancy, the tenant's a good tenant, you leave it for another year and then maybe drifts on from there. You're not putting up the rent every year because the tenant would just leave if that was the case. What does happen though, if a landlord does not put up their rent for say 5 years and then suddenly their interest rate's gone up and other costs have gone up and Section 24 tax hike, George Osborne's tax hikes has affected their profitability, then maybe then they start increasing rent to the market rent, the current market rent, which obviously 5 years ago was a lot less. And the reason rents are getting high is because, you know, maybe up to 100,000 landlords have already quit the market in fear of these sorts of measures and because of George Osborne's Section 24 tax hike on landlords. I'll come on to that in a second. So rent controls is a serious issue. And as I said, it didn't work in Scotland and Wales, so I don't know why they're proposing to bring this in. Third thing is mandatory property standards. The bill also proposes stricter property standards, requiring landlords to ensure their properties meet higher quality benchmarks, as if we haven't got enough problems. This includes ensuring proper insulation, energy efficiency, overall habitability, and non-compliance could result in hefty fines or penalties. Now, we've already got laws in place to do this. You've already got laws in place, but they want to nail it down more. Don't forget, the Labour government, their philosophy is against private ownership. It's certainly against private landlords. They don't like landlords, but we're here, because they haven't built, and no other government since the 70s has really built enough council social houses. And those sort of properties should be taking the tenants who want to stay in one place forever and on a reasonable rent. That should be the government's job, the local authority's job, but they haven't done it. They haven't built them. So that's coming in. Number 4 is longer tenancy agreements. Labour advocates the standardisation of longer tenancy agreements, such as a 3-year contract to provide tenants with more stability. This is, they're just ignoring the needs of landlords here completely. Whilst this benefits tenants, landlords may find it challenging to adapt to their longer term commitments. This doesn't work for everybody. I'm dealing with a case at the moment, which is a probate case. They're waiting for probate to be granted, a property they've inherited. They want to rent it out for a year and then they'll sell the property. How's that going to work with this? It just won't work. And then, at the end of the year, will the tenant want to leave? This is another story, isn't it? So those are the main points: security, rent controls, mandatory property standards, longer tenancy agreements. A lot of landlords have already been through this, extra legislation, which is why some of them just got fed up and quit it, or they go into serviced accommodation. But I don't know if that's going to work in the long term. Jeremy Hunt, the last Chancellor, said he'd abolish those tax breaks for serviced accommodation. So you can't have every landlord goes down the serviced accommodation route. The government's just going to crack down on that as well. So what's the impact here? Financial implications, obviously. Rent controls could really hit landlords. Landlords have got to reevaluate what they want to do here. Increased compliance and regulatory compliance. That's just a pain in the neck, particularly for small landlords. And just like, Labour also bringing in more employment rights. And of course, big companies that employ, thousands of people and have got 5 HR officers, they can cope with all this. But smaller companies find it very, very difficult. I've ran a small business, with up to 50 staff. And it's very hard to deal with all these changes, pensions regulations, this change, national insurance, all these things. And it's all a cost on business because you have to employ someone just to deal with all of this crap. So how else will it affect? Changes in investment strategy. What will they do? How are they going to get around this? Will they just sell the properties? I don't know. It's very difficult to sell a property and then start paying tax, the capital gains tax on the gain you've made, and then what do you do with the money after that? Other things that could impact is on property supply. As landlords move away from the normal traditional buy-to-let market, what's going to happen? There'll be less properties to rent, and of course the rents will go up. And that's already started to happen. So in conclusion, the new Labour government's Renters' Rights Bill, not Reform, Rights Bill, is set out a comprehensive reforms in the rental market. They really want to put the boot in on private landlords. So just watch out. It hasn't come in yet, but just stay tuned, and I will give you more information on this. So you need to really start thinking about adapting to this. Okay, now as I said, the last government didn't really do us any favours either, did they? We had George Osborne with his Section 24 tax hike. And what he did, in effect, was, and this is another reason why landlords have left the market, he said you are no longer allowed to offset the interest cost against your overall turnover. Any business, if you have turnover, which is the amount you've got coming in, your sales, you have expenses, and one of those expenses is interest payments. So if you've got a business loan or a business overdraft, you deduct that interest. It's the same for every business, whether you're a sole trader or limited company. What does George Osborne did was said, no, that's not the case now. If the property is in your own name, you can no longer claim this. Now, he didn't do this for limited companies and big companies like big hedge funds and banks that own properties. No, he looked after his friends in the city, but not the small landlords, and he kicked them in the teeth. And I had a go at some of these the ministers at the time, I met one of the ministers, he said, well, we want corporates, we don't want mom and pop landlords. Cheeky so-and-so, I could have really punched the guy because he's a horrible guy, and we don't want mom and pop landlords. These are your voters, these are people who vote for you. So anyway, what can you do? So you can either sell the property, pay the tax, right? You can try and adjust your income, because if you're into higher rates of tax, this will affect you. You'll start to pay more tax, and a lot of landlords are now in negative rent cash flow because there are higher rate tax. Now, if you're a basic rate tax rate, it doesn't affect you too much, but a lot of people are now moving into higher rate taxes because the government have frozen the thresholds. The thresholds used to go up and up and up each year. Now they've frozen them, so more people are getting trapped in this higher rates of tax. And that's up to 40% tax. So if you're in that rate, your tax will be affected. So a lot of landlords only own one or two properties. Most of them do. So they can't live on that. They have a job, and this property may be something that they've inherited. It may be part of their pension strategy. So they've got a job, and they're now they've got this property which is making a small surplus. Now it's not, because they're paying more tax. There's other things you can do with your accountant. Maybe you can split the income between husband and wife if you're married. But there is another way around it, and that's to move the properties into a limited company. Now again, people say, well, that means you're effectively selling the property to the limited company. What about capital gains tax? Well, again, some clever tax advisors have worked out a way to deal with this, and I deal with them. He's a chartered tax advisor, and you can move your properties into a limited company structure. It takes a couple of years. It's not a simple process, and then you've got the property in a limited company. You will start paying. You'll be able to claim the interest against the rent, and you will pay less tax. But there's other advantages to that. It's not just about the tax. Having properties in a limited company can lead to several advantages. Now look, if you've only got one property, and you only intend to have one property, this may not be worth it for you. Maybe you could work out a way of paying off some of the mortgage or something. If you've got one property and that's all, you're not going to do any more, then I would say maybe you have to stick with it, or find other ways of mitigating tax. But if you want to expand your business and have more than one property, several properties, a limited company structure is much better for you, because you can allocate shares to people. You can, instead of having to split the property up itself, you can allocate the shares in the property company. And this has massive advantage if you want to eventually pass on a legacy to your children or family members, because you can allocate shares. You can call them non-voting shares, so they haven't got control of the company, but they already own the shares, and then you won't be subject to taxes later on. It helps with inheritance tax. Now, there was a record amount of inheritance tax paid in terms of government receipts. I think it's 175 million or billion, I can't remember now, but it was a massive figure of tax paid on inheritance tax, which is largely a voluntary tax. If you work out how to deal with the tax before somebody dies, you can offset a lot of that. And this is what the aristocracy have done. This is what people like the Duke of Westminster did. The young Duke of Westminster inherited 9 billion and didn't pay any tax. Why? Because they deal with it. They plan for it. They've got trusts, and the property's in trust. Now, that's another thing, because with a limited company structure, you can find it easier to put properties in trust. And if you're leaving it to, say, 3 children, for instance, it's much easier to divide a company up and say, well, you have shares, you have shares, you have shares, rather than trying to say, well, you have that property over there, and I'll leave that property down to you, and I'll leave that one over there to you. There could be totally different values. How do you do it? It's much more complicated. So there's lots of things you can do. So I would definitely say, if you've got more than one property and you plan to expand your business, go down the limited company route. Now, I said chartered tax advisor a while ago. What's the difference between a chartered tax advisor and a chartered accountant? Well, a chartered accountant or an accountant will generally do your books. They will prepare your accounts and say, this is how much tax you're going to pay. A chartered tax advisor can do all of that, but the chartered tax advisor can plan your tax. So rather than you wait until the end of the year and say, here's the tax bill, you can start at the beginning of the year and say, what can I do to mitigate that tax so I pay less tax? And this is where a chartered tax advisor has that extra training and extra experience to deal with it. They can deal with trusts. They can save you money on inheritance tax. They can also save you money on stamp duty. A lot of people have overpaid on stamp duty for previous properties, and a lot of people don't realise you can claim that back. So a chartered tax advisor is definitely somebody you want to deal with. And often, when people go to a chartered tax advisor, they say, well, this is what you need to do to move your properties. And they go back to their accountant, and the accountant says, oh, no, you can't do that. That's tax avoidance, and the HMRC won't allow it. But these things have been allowed. The chartered tax advisor are not, throwing these things and throwing some mud against the wall and seeing how much of it sticks. They know what they're doing, but the chartered accountant gets worried. They worry that, I might lose this client. So they try and squash it by putting fear into the client. So no, you can't do that. And of course, the client would trust the guy they've maybe been dealing with for 10 years, not realizing that they're probably advising that out of a certain amount of ignorance, So certainly do think about that. So look, if you're in this position and you're worried about future tax, inheritance tax, stamp duty, or you just want to reduce your income tax right now, I'll put a link up to my email address. Email me your details and I'll immediately refer you on to the chartered tax advisor, and they will give you a free consultation to help you get through this maze of tax legislation that was put on us by George Osborne. So sorry it's a bit of doom and gloom here, but there's usually a way around things. Business people have a way of adapting. They're survivors. There's always a way of adapting. So again, we've got the Renters' Rights Bill coming in, and we have to deal with Section 24 as well. So get in touch with me if you need any help on that, and I'll refer you to the chartered tax advisor to save you tax, not only now but for future, so that you can pass on a legacy to your children without too much hassle. Thanks very much indeed, and bye for now. Have a great day.